The folding chair toppled backward and clattered across the parade deck before a single sailor thought to catch it. For a half second, nobody moved. 800 people in dress whites, the ocean wind off Coronado snapping the flags. And the only sound was that one folding chair rolling on its side across the concrete. Then a 4-star Admiral stepped off the reviewing stand, walked down the line of new graduates, stopped in front of a 47-year-old woman in a plain gray coat, and brought her hand up in a salute so crisp it could have cut glass. Not the sister who skipped every Thanksgiving, not the woman they called a quitter at every Jessup table. Night Reaper. By the time the bugle faded, every person who had ever called Opal a coward would be on their feet, and one of them would be weeping into his dress whites. I know, because I was the woman in the gray coat, and the man crying was the same uncle who had spent 23 years toasting to the sailors who didn't run. But you don't understand any of that yet. Neither did they. So let me take you back to a red dirt yard in Lubbock, Texas, 3 weeks earlier, where the whole thing started the way it always started, with brisket, folding chairs, and a glass raised in my direction. The Jessups had held the same reunion off 23rd and Boston Avenue for 40 years. Same tech terrace bungalow my grandfather bought in 1961. Same red dirt that got into everything. Same window unit rattling in the back bedroom like it was trying to shake loose and die. You could set your watch by it. First Saturday in June, the whole clan crammed into a yard the size of a postage stamp, smoke rolling off the offset smoker, country radio low under the talk, and a flag on a pole by the driveway that my Uncle Marshall never ever let come down. I parked 2 houses down that afternoon, the way I always did. Habit. You give yourself a path out. I sat in the truck a minute with the engine ticking and looked at the thing on the passenger seat that I carried to every family event and never once opened. A gunmetal ammunition tin. Old. Army green gone gray at the corners. Soldered shut along the lid, a clean bead of solder somebody had run by hand and stenciled across the front in white block letters that had half worn away. J. Jessup. My father. Chief Warrant Officer Jacob Jessup, dead 11 months, and this tin was the only thing he'd left to me specifically by name, in a will that gave my brother the house and my uncle the truck. I didn't know what was in it. I'd shaken it once. Something shifted, soft and heavy, and something else rattled like a spool. The lawyer who read the will said my father had been very clear. Opal gets the tin, sealed, and Opal decides when. That was it. No key because there was no lock, just that soldered seam and a man's stubbornness baked into the metal. I left it on the seat. You don't bring a closed thing into a house full of people who'll ask what's inside. Inside the yard, the noise hit me first. My cousin's kids were running a popsicle relay, juice melting down their wrists onto the dirt. My Aunt Carol was at the folding table arranging deviled eggs like the eggs had ever once been the point. And my Uncle Marshall stood by the smoker with a long neck in his fist and a paper plate balanced on the cooler lid, holding court the way he'd held court my entire life. Marshall Jessup. 61 years old, barrel through the chest, a navy ball cap he'd worn so long the bill had gone soft. He'd done 4 years as a chief before I was born, and you would think, to hear him, that he'd personally won 3 wars. He hadn't. But Marshall had learned a long time ago that if you say a thing loud enough and often enough, a family will simply agree to remember it your way. He saw me come through the gate. He always saw me come through the gate. Well, he said, loud enough for the whole yard. Look who decided to grace us. A few people laughed. Not mean, exactly. Just easy. The way you laugh at a joke you've heard 100 times and still find comfortable. I said hello. I found a folding chair at the edge, the one by the fence that wobbled, and I sat down with my plate, and I kept my back straight and my mouth shut. That was the role. I'd been playing it since I was 24 years old. The quiet one. The one who couldn't be trusted with a real answer. You learn to sit in it the way you learn to sit in a cold cockpit before dawn. Stillness is a skill. People who've never needed it mistake it for nothing. My brother Wade was over by the cooler, 39, lean, sunburned at the neck. Wade and I had been close once, back before everything. He glanced at me, and then he found something very interesting to look at on the ground. He couldn't hold my eyes for more than a second. He hadn't been able to for years, and I'd never let myself ask why, because I thought I already knew. I thought he believed what they all believed. Marshall let me get one bite of brisket down, then he tapped his bottle with a fork, that high, cheap ring that means somebody's about to make everybody listen. Before we eat, he said, "I want to say something. Same as I say every year, because it matters." I kept my eyes on my plate. I knew the words before he said them. I could have mouthed along. "To the Jessups who served," Marshall said, lifting the long neck. "The real ones. The ones who put on the uniform and didn't quit when it got hard." A pause. The showman's pause. The one he'd spent decades perfecting. Not everybody's got the stomach for a man's job. Some folks find out real quick they'd rather run home and hide. He grinned right at me. "No offense, Opal. We all know you tried." And the yard laughed. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. They want the villain to snarl. He didn't snarl. He grinned, warm as a summer porch, like he was doing me a kindness by saying it gently. The cruelty was casual. That's what made it land. He announced it the way you'd announce that it might rain Sunday, and the people I shared blood with laughed into their paper cups, and my brother looked at the dirt. I reached into my coat pocket. There was a coin there I carried, worn brass, the kind a man rubs smooth without thinking. Around the rim, struck deep, 2 words, Night Reaper. I turned it over once between my fingers under the table, twice. It's a thing I do when the room laughs. Nobody had ever asked me what it was. Nobody had ever asked me much of anything. I set down my fork. I squared it next to the plate, corners straight, the way my father taught me to leave a thing when you're done with it. And I said, level and quiet, "It's good brisket, Marshall." That was all. That was always all. People like my uncle expect a flinch. When you don't give them one, they fill the silence themselves, and what they fill it with usually tells you everything. "See, that's what I mean," he said to the cooler crowd, spreading his hands. "Cool as a cucumber. Nothing rattles little Opal. You know why? Because nothing's in there." He tapped his temple, grinning. Lights on. Nobody flying the plane. I had heard louder men in quieter wars. Marshall's little speech did not move me much. But I will tell you the truth, because there's no point pretending I'm made of stone. 23 years of that, and it still found the soft place. Every single time. What none of them knew, what I had sworn on a thing I could not break that they would never know, was that for 19 of those years, I had flown a helicopter into the dark places men don't come back from, and brought people home. Calm to the point that other pilots found it eerie. They used to say I had ice for blood. I didn't. I had my father's voice in my headset from when I was 16 years old, teaching me to fly a crop duster by starlight over the cotton fields north of Lubbock, saying the same thing he said every time the dark got thick and the horizon disappeared. "Fly the quiet one home, Opal. Just fly the quiet one home." I never knew, back then, what the quiet one meant. I thought it was him being gentle. I'd find out on a parade deck 3 weeks later that it was something else entirely, that my father had known, that he'd always known. But I'm getting ahead. After the toast, the reunion went back to being a reunion. Horseshoes, the kids screaming, Marshall holding court. I helped Aunt Carol carry the cobbler out, and she squeezed my arm and said, "Low, he doesn't mean it, hon," which is the thing people say when they've decided not to stop something. I told her the cobbler smelled like heaven, and I let it go. It was Wade who found me, later, when the light went long and gold over the fence line and most everyone had drifted to lawn chairs. He came and stood next to me by the truck, both of us looking at nothing. The way our family says hard things, sideways and aimed at the horizon. "Opal," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to not make it weird." "All right." He had a folder in his hand. I recognized the crest before he turned it over. An eagle, an anchor, a trident. My stomach did a slow thing it hadn't done in years. I made it, Wade said. Through selection, the whole thing. I pinned the trident in 3 weeks, out in Coronado. He said it fast, like he was ashamed of being proud of it. Graduation, families invited. I looked at him, my little brother, the boy I taught to ride a bike on this same red dirt, a Navy SEAL, and something in my chest cracked clean open with a pride so big I couldn't get a word past it. Wade, I started. I need you to not come, he said. The wind came up off the field and rattled the dry grass along the fence. It's a whole thing, he said fast, looking anywhere but at me. Marshall's coming, the whole family. There's a reception, there's brass everywhere, there's a reviewing Admiral. It's a big deal, Opal, and I can't have it go sideways. I can't have anybody asking about He swallowed. About what happened with you, the Navy stuff. Not on that day, not in front of those people. For the family's sake. You understand. I understood. That was the worst of it. I understood completely. 23 years ago, when I was 24 years old, I had vanished from this family under a paper trail that said one word about me. Absent without leave. Then later, a worse one. Deserted. And I had let them believe it. I had stood in front of my own father and said nothing, because the truth was sealed behind something I was not permitted to break. An oath stamped with classifications I couldn't say out loud in a Lubbock backyard. The silence cost me every holiday. It cost me my father's last years. It cost me my brother's eyes, the way he couldn't lift them to mine. And now it was going to cost me the proudest day of his life because he had grown up at those tables too, and he believed the legend the same as all of them, that his big sister was the Jessup who ran. I looked at the tin on my passenger seat, sealed, soldered, J. Jessup in worn white block letters, my father's last word to me, and I still hadn't opened it. For the family's sake, I said. Wade nodded, relieved, and went back to the party. I sat in the truck a long time after that, in the dark, with the window unit rattling somewhere behind me and the flag hanging dead still on its pole. I picked up the tin and set it in my lap and ran my thumb along that hand-laid bead of solder my father had sealed with his own hands. And for the first time in 11 months, I thought about what it would take to open it. I didn't decide to go. That's the honest way to say it. I told myself for 19 days that I was going to respect what my brother asked, and on the 20th day I found myself at 4 a.m, standing in my kitchen with a thermos in one hand and the tin under my other arm, and the truck keys were already in my pocket. Some part of me that doesn't ask permission had decided for the rest of me. It's the same part that used to fly, so I drove. Lubbock to Coronado is a long pull, the kind of drive where the country changes under you a piece at a time. The red dirt giving way to scrub, and then to that hard, bright nothing out past El Paso. And then, finally, late on the second day, the smell of the Pacific coming in through the vents before I ever saw the water. I set the tin on the passenger seat the whole way, belted in like a person. I'd catch myself glancing at it the way you glance at someone riding shotgun who's gone quiet. J. Jessup. My father's name in white block letters worn soft at the edges, and that bead of solder along the lid that I had run my thumb over 1,000 times and never broken. I want to tell you, I had a plan. I didn't. I had a brother who'd asked me to stay home, and a coin in my pocket, and a sealed tin on the seat, and the oldest habit I owned, which was to go toward the dark place anyway and figure out the landing on the way down. I told myself I'd watch from the back, just see him pin the trident, stand at the fence like I stood at every fence, and leave before anyone had to know my face was there. That was the whole of it. Watch the quiet one home and slip out. The base was its own country. I'd worn a different uniform, flown out of different fields, but a military installation has a grammar you don't forget, and my body remembered it before my mind caught up. The gait, the clipped courtesy. The particular way young men and women in PT gear move when they've been awake longer than is reasonable and have decided not to let it show. I parked where a guard pointed me, in a gravel lot off the road that ran along the beach, and I sat for a minute with the engine ticking, the way it always ticked, and then I left the tin on the seat, and I got out, and I walked toward the sound of a class getting smoked on the sand. Hell Week was behind these kids by the time I got there, but the days before a graduation are their own kind of grinding. I came up along a fence line above the beach, and I watched a knot of candidates running a boat over their heads, and off to the side, half folded over with his hands on his knees, was one who'd come undone. You know it when you see it. It isn't the body quitting. The body quits all the time and gets told to keep going and does. It's the other thing, the thing behind the eyes, where a young man has done the arithmetic in his head and decided he is not enough, and the deciding is louder than the instructor. He was maybe 22, sandy, sunburned, shaking, staring at the surf like it had said something to him. I shouldn't have stopped. I had no standing there. A woman in a gray coat at a fence is nobody. But I have pulled people out of places worse than their own heads, and I know the look, and I have never in my life been able to walk past it. I didn't give him a speech. People who've never been in the dark think you fix a frightened person with words. Big ones, words about courage. You don't. You make the world small enough for them to hold. "Hey," I said, low, over the fence. He looked up, startled that anyone outside the wire had spoken. "Don't look at the ocean. The ocean's not the test." I waited till his eyes came to me. "Next 30 seconds. That's all you owe anybody. Breathe in for the count, hold it at the top, let it go slow. Then the next 30. You don't have to finish. You just have to fly the quiet one home." I didn't even hear myself say it until it was out. My father's line. It had been living in my mouth for 40 years, and it came out on its own, handed to a stranger. The kid blinked. Something in his chest unlocked. I watched it happen. The way I'd watched it happen in a dozen frightened faces over a headset. He stood up a little straighter. He breathed in for the count, and an instructor barked and he was gone, back to the boat, back to the line, and he never knew my name, and I figured I'd never know his. 3 quiet words was how he'd put it later, when it mattered. She told me 3 quiet words and I stopped wanting to quit. He'd get the count wrong, it was more than 3, but that's how people remember the thing that saved them. Small enough to carry. I thought that was the end of my part. It wasn't close, because a man had seen me at the fence. Not the candidate, a base mechanic, gray at the temples, in coveralls with a rag hanging out of the hip pocket, who'd been crossing from the equipment sheds and had stopped to watch me talk a kid back from the edge. He came over, slow, wiping his hands, and he looked at me the way you look at a word you can almost read. "You fly?" he said. It wasn't a guess. Mechanics can tell. Something in how a person stands near machinery, how their eyes go to the rotor mast first, that we can't hide from each other. "Used to," I said. He kept wiping his hands that didn't need wiping. "You stand like somebody I used to know." He tipped his head toward the sheds. "Got a bird back there that won't talk to me. Ground crew's been on her 2 days. You want to look or you want to keep being mysterious?" I should have said no. I want that on the record. Every reasonable voice I had said no. Stay at the fence, watch your brother, leave. But there's a grounded aircraft and there's me, and there has never once been a contest between those 2 things. The helo sat in the shed with its panels open like a patient on a table. A young crew chief had a multimeter out and a frustrated set to his jaw, chasing an electrical gremlin that wasn't electrical. I stood in the doorway and I listened, that's all. They'd been chasing it with meters and I just listened to the auxiliaries spin up and die, and I heard it the way my father taught me to hear an engine over a field at night, when your eyes are useless and your ears are the only instrument you trust. "It's not your wiring," I said. "Listen to her at the top of the spin. She's starving. You've got air where you want fuel. Check the line where it bends behind the firewall. Somebody torqued a fitting proud and she's pulling a breath she shouldn't." The crew chief looked at me like I'd walked in off the street and started speaking in tongues, which I had. But the older mechanic just nodded, slow, like a thing he'd suspected, and put a wrench where I'd pointed. And inside of 5 minutes, that bird was breathing clean and steady, and the whole shed went quiet in the particular way a shed goes quiet when the new person turns out to be somebody. "Where'd you learn an engine by ear?" the older man asked. "My father," I said. "Crop duster, north of Lubbock. He taught me to fly at night by the sound of the field." The rag stopped moving in his hands. "Lubbock," he said. "Your father." He set the rag down on the cowling, gentle, like it had become important not to make noise. "What was his name?" "Jacob," I said. "Jacob Jessup. He's gone now. About a year. I have seen a lot of faces do a lot of things. I had never seen a grown man look like the floor had moved under him while he stood perfectly still. He put one hand flat on the helo, steadying himself against the very machine I'd just fixed. And when he spoke, his voice had gone rough at the bottom. "Chief J," he said, "your daddy. He paid for my certification. 19 years ago. I was a dumb kid pumping gas in Amarillo with a baby coming and no way up, and a man I'd met exactly twice wrote a check for my school and told me to never mention it to anybody and to pass it on when I could." He shook his head slow. I always wondered what Chief J was. He never would say. Said he was just a man who flew at night. His eyes came up to mine, wet at the rims. He had a daughter, he told me once. Said she was the best stick he ever saw and that nobody'd ever know it. Said it like it cost him something. The wind came in through the open shed and moved nothing because there was nothing loose to move. And I stood there with 23 years of being called a coward going strange and weightless in my chest. Because here was a stranger in coveralls telling me my father had spent the years I thought he'd spent ashamed of me quietly building a road out of the dark for kids who'd never know his name, and telling them about me, out loud, where I couldn't hear. He knew. I hadn't let myself believe it. I'd stood in front of him with the truth locked behind an oath and watched him not ask, and I'd read his silence as disappointment for 2 decades. He knew. He always knew. He just couldn't say it any more than I could, so he'd done the only thing a man like that can do with a truth he isn't allowed to speak. He'd planted it where it would grow up around me when he was gone. I had to put my hand on the helo, too, then. The two of us, holding up a machine that didn't need holding. That should have been enough to undo me for one day. It wasn't the end of it either, because the young crew chief, the one with the multimeter, had been standing back through all of this, watching. And now he cleared his throat the careful way a junior man does when he's about to step into something above his pay grade. He was one of the graduating class, it turned out, slotted to a mechanic's billet due to walk the deck with the others in 2 days. And he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't place, somewhere between fear and hope. "Ma'am," he said, "this is going to sound crazy, but a man paid my BUD/S prep. Couple years back, anonymous, through some scholarship fund I never could find a name on." He swallowed. "The only thing that ever came with it was one instruction, passed down through the office that handled it. Whoever set it up left a note. It said, if I ever made it this far, I was supposed to find his daughter at the graduation. He was searching my face now openly. It said she'd know what to do. That's all. Find his daughter, she'll know what to do." His voice dropped. "Nobody could ever tell me who his daughter was. But you just walked in off the road and fixed a bird by ear and told a man not to quit. And you said Lubbock and you said Jacob. The shed was very quiet. I did not know what to do. That's the truth, I'll tell you plainly. For the first time in a very long time, I, who had a calm that other pilots called eerie, who'd been told I had ice for blood, stood in a cold metal shed by the Pacific with no idea what came next. My father had reached out of a soldered tin and a year in the ground and set a thing in motion years before he died, a thing that was now standing in front of me in coveralls, asking me to be who I'd spent my whole life not being allowed to be. I reached into my coat pocket the way I do when a room gets to be too much, and I turned the brass coin over once, twice. Night Reaper struck deep around the rim, worn smooth from 23 years of being the only thing in any room that knew my name. And somewhere out on that base, A chief I'd never met was about to walk past me, glance at my hand, and stop dead. The chief's name was Hollis. I didn't know that yet, standing in the shed with my thumb on the worn rim of that coin, but I'd learn it inside the hour, the way you learn the names of people who change the shape of your life without meaning to. He was a senior enlisted man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathering on him that comes from 20 years of salt and sun and standing on flight decks. He'd come to the sheds to chase down a part for the ceremony, some bit of ceremonial bright work that had to gleam by morning, and he came through the open bay still talking over his shoulder to somebody behind him, and then he saw my hand. I want you to understand that I wasn't holding the coin up. I wasn't showing it to anybody. It was a private thing, the way it had always been a private thing, turning over in my fingers low at my side where the family couldn't see it, laugh back at them. But a man like Hollis doesn't need it held up. His eyes went to my hand the way a mechanic's eyes go to a rotor mast, the way mine had gone to the open panels on that helo, and he stopped mid-sentence with his mouth still half-shaped around a word he never finished. "Where?" he said. Then he stopped, started over, quieter, like the volume of it scared him. "Where did you get that coin?" I closed my fingers over it. Old habit. 23 years of closing my hand over the only thing that ever told the truth about me. "It's mine," I said. That's not what I asked. He came across the shed slow, the way you approach a thing you're afraid will turn out to be a trick of the light. He had eyes only for my hand now, for the dull gleam of brass between my fingers. "There's maybe 9 of those coins struck in the whole world, ma'am. I've seen exactly one of them before tonight, and it was in a case behind glass, and the man who put it there doesn't let people touch it." His voice had gone to almost nothing. "Open your hand." I don't know why I did it. I'd kept that coin hidden through 1,000 reunions, through Marshall's toasts, through my father's funeral where I'd held it in my pocket through the whole service because it was the only thing keeping me upright. But there was something in this man's face, some recognition that wasn't cruelty and wasn't pity, something I had not been on the receiving end of in so long I'd half forgotten it existed. So I opened my hand. The coin lay there on my palm. Brass gone soft and golden with handling, and around its rim, struck deep and worn smooth at the high points, the 2 words, Night Reaper. Hollis made a sound, not a word. The kind of sound a man makes when something he thought was only a story turns out to be standing in front of him in a gray coat with engine grease on her knuckles. He took a step back, and his hand came up. And for one terrible second, I thought he was going to salute me right there in the shed, and I think if he had, I'd have come apart entirely. But he caught himself. He was a chief. He knew there was a right place for that, and a shed at midnight wasn't it. "Night Reaper," he said. It wasn't a question this time. It was the way you say a name you've carried a long way. "You're Night Reaper." My God. They told us you were a legend somebody made up to keep the new pilots humble. They told us nobody knew if you were even real. "I'm real," I said. It came out smaller than I meant it. "The pickup off the water," he said. "The one they teach. The bird that got hit and the pilot who didn't break formation, who came back through weather that grounded everybody else and made the recovery and never once raised her voice on the net." He was shaking his head the whole time he said it, like the saying of it made it less believable, not more. We listened to a piece of that audio in a leadership course, 10 seconds of it. The instructor played it and asked us what we heard, and we all said calm, and he said no. He said what you're hearing is a person who decided a long time ago that other people's lives weren't going to be made worse by her fear. Hollis looked at me. He said that's what discipline actually is, not the absence of fear, the refusal to spend it on the people counting on you, the mechanic in the coveralls, the one my father had put through school, had gone still by the cowling, the young crew chief, the one with the scholarship and the instruction to find Chief Jay's daughter, had both hands pressed flat against the helo now like he needed it to stand. And me, I just stood there with the coin in my open palm and 23 years of being the Jessup who ran cracking apart down the middle, very quietly, the way ice gives on a pond before it goes. "I have to make a call," Hollis said. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I have to. There's somebody who'd want to know you're on this base, somebody who's looked for you." He was already stepping back toward the bay door, already reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "Don't go anywhere, please, please don't disappear again." He didn't know how funny that was to ask me not to disappear. Disappearing was the only thing the family had ever credited me with doing well. I didn't run. I want that noted, because every instinct I owned was screaming at me to walk back to the truck and drive into the dark and let the legend stay buried where it was comfortable. But my father had reached out of the ground and put a road under 3 strangers' feet and pointed all of them at me. And somewhere in me, I understood that running now wouldn't be discipline anymore. It would just be cowardice wearing discipline's coat, the very thing they'd accused me of. So I stayed. I walked back out to the fence line above the beach, and I stood where I could see the water going silver under a low moon, and I waited, and the coin stayed warm in my closed hand. Word climbs a chain of command faster than you'd think when the word is the right word. I'd learn later that Hollis's call went to a duty officer, and the duty officer made a face and almost dismissed it, and then said the 2 words out loud to a commander who'd flown in the same theater I had, and that commander went white and said, "Get me a name, get me a service record." And within 40 minutes, the 2 words Night Reaper had traveled up through the dark of that base like a current finding ground, until they reached a room where a 4-star Admiral was reviewing the next morning's program, and she set down her pen. I didn't know any of that was happening. I was at the fence. But I felt the base change around me the way you feel weather change before it arrives. A pressure shift, a quiet that has tension in it. Headlights moved on the road, doors. The particular brisk quiet of people who have somewhere to be at an hour when they shouldn't. And then morning came, the way it always comes whether you're ready for it or not. Gray first and then gold off the Pacific, and the parade deck began to fill. I'll tell you about the family arriving, because that's the part that mattered to the wound, even with everything else swinging into motion around me. They'd flown out, the Jessups, a whole knot of them, because a boy of theirs was making seal, and that was worth closing the hardware store for and buying the plane tickets they grumbled about. Wade had asked me not to come, and I'd come anyway, and now I stood at the back of the visitor seating in my gray coat with the tin under my arm, and I watched them file in not 20 yards from me, and not one of them saw me, because they weren't looking. You don't look for someone you've already decided isn't there. And then I saw Marshall. Uncle Marshall, who'd worn his old Navy bearing like a coat 2 sizes too big for 40 years, who'd toasted the real sailors at every reunion since before I left, who'd grinned across the brisket and said little Opal couldn't hack a man's job, so she ran home and hid. Said it so many times it had stopped being a sentence and become a fact, a load-bearing wall in the house of the family's idea of itself. He came up the walk in a sport coat with a flag pin on the lapel, chin up, working the small crowd of relatives like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for a stage this size. His nephew, a SEAL. He'd be telling that story at the store counter for the rest of his life, to anybody who came in for a box of drywall screws. He saw me. I watched it happen. I watched his eyes pass over the visitor seating and snag on the gray coat and the straight back and the woman who didn't belong. And I watched the grin curdle on his face into something between disbelief and fury. He came over. Of course he came over. Marshall could no more leave a thing alone than the tide could. "You," he said low, so the family wouldn't hear, leaning in with that flag pin catching the morning light. "What in God's name do you think you're doing here? Wade told you. The whole family told you. This is his day. This is the one clean thing this family's got, and you are not going to stand here in your funeral coat and make it about you running off." His jaw worked. Whatever you came to say, you keep it shut. For once in your life, you keep it shut. We are not going to have you embarrass that boy in front of the United States Navy. And here is the thing I want you to sit with, because it's the whole of him in one breath. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. He built his entire standing in that family on me being the coward, on there being one Jessup who'd run, so that he could be the one who hadn't. His own discharge had been a quiet thing, an unheroic thing, a door that closed early and without ceremony, and there was a back room at his hardware store off 23rd that he kept locked, that he never let anyone into, full of envelopes he didn't open anymore, the store 3 payments from going under, and the family name the only collateral he had left. If I was never the coward, then the story tipped, and the only Jessup who'd ever really run home and hidden was the man standing in front of me with the flag pin and the shaking hands. He didn't know I knew about the back room. He didn't know I knew about any of it. He just knew, in the animal part of a man that knows before he can say it, that I was a danger to the only version of himself he could stand to live inside. So I did the thing I have always done. I gave him a level gaze and nothing more. "I'm just here to watch Wade," I said. It was even true, as far as it went. "I'll stand in the back. You won't know I'm here." "See that I don't," he said, and he turned on his heel and went back to the family with his chin up, already rearranging his face into the proud uncle, already certain he'd handled it, certain the quiet one would stay quiet the way she always had. I found a seat at the very back, on the aisle, near a gap in the chairs where I could slip out clean when it was over. The tin sat in my lap. J. Jessup in worn white letters. The bead of solder my father had laid with his own hands, still unbroken. I'd carried it 2,000 miles, and I still hadn't opened it, and I told myself I wasn't going to. I told myself I'd watch Wade pin the trident and slip out the back and drive home and let the legend stay buried. The band came up. The graduating class marched onto the deck in their dress whites, rows of young men squared away and gleaming, and somewhere in that formation was my baby brother, the quiet one, the one I used to fly home in the dark, and my throat closed so hard I couldn't have spoken if my life depended on it. The colors passed. We stood, we sat, and then a voice on the loudspeaker said the reviewing officer would address the class, and a 4-star Admiral walked to the podium in service dress, and I looked up at her face for the first time in 23 years. And the morning went very far away and very quiet because I knew her. I had known her over a headset in the worst weather of my life. I had carried her people home. Admiral Daria Van set her hands on the podium and looked out over the rows of dress whites, and then, slow, like she was looking for something she'd been told would be there, she looked past the class, out into the visitor seating, toward the back, toward the aisle, toward a woman in a gray coat with a soldered tin in her lap, and she stopped. The Admiral did not finish her remarks. She had a card in her hand with the morning's program printed on it, the order of events, the names of the men about to earn the trident, and she set that card face down on the podium, like a woman folding a hand she no longer needed to play. The deck went quiet in that particular way a military formation goes quiet, which is not the absence of sound but the presence of attention. 300 people understanding at once that the script had just been set aside. Daria Van came down off the podium. She did it slowly, deliberately, and she walked across the open deck in her service dress with the 4 stars catching the morning. And she walked past the rows of dress whites, past the visiting dignitaries, past the chairs full of families who had flown in from everywhere, and she walked toward the back, toward the aisle, toward me. That was when the folding chair went over. A young officer near the front had risen too fast to track where she was going, caught his chair with the back of his knee, and it toppled backward and clattered across the parade deck before a single sailor thought to catch it. Nobody moved to pick it up. Every eye in that place had followed the Admiral's line of sight, and her line of sight ended at a 47-year-old woman in a gray coat with a soldered tin in her lap, A woman who had skipped every Thanksgiving, a woman they called a quitter, at every Jessup table. She stopped 3 feet from me. I got to my feet because you do not stay seated when a flag officer is standing in front of you. The body remembers that even when the rest of you has spent 23 years forgetting it had ever been a sailor at all. And Admiral Daria Van looked at my face, at the lines the years had cut into it, and something moved behind her eyes, some recognition crossing a great distance, and she lifted her right hand to the brim of her cover, and she held a salute on me there in front of the whole base. "Night Reaper," she said, and she said it loud enough to carry. "I have been looking for you for a very long time. I want to tell you what a salute like that does. It is not the gesture. It is the silence around the gesture. 300 people processing 2 words, the families turning to each other and mouthing them, the candidates in their formation breaking discipline by a hair to glance sideways. And somewhere in the visitor seating, a man with a flag pin on his lapel who had spent 40 years toasting the real sailors went the color of ash. I returned the salute. My hand knew the angle. It had not forgotten. "Ma'am," I said. That was all. The premise note in my chest, the lifelong instruction to answer the world with a level gaze and nothing more, held even now. Van lowered her hand. She looked down at the tin in my arms, the gunmetal box with J. Jessup stenciled in worn white paint, the bead of solder her old friend had laid along the seam with his own hands, and her composure cracked for just a second, the way a deck plate flexes under a load it was built for but never wanted. "He told me about that box," she said quietly. "Jacob, your father. He wrote me a letter the last year of his life, and he told me that when his youngest made the teams, I'd find his daughter near the back, and that she'd be carrying everything I needed in a tin she'd never been able to bring herself to open." Her jaw worked. He couldn't unseal it himself. Neither could I while he was breathing. But he is not breathing now, and you are standing on my deck, and I am done letting this Navy call you a thing you were never permitted to deny. She turned to a chief beside her, Hollis, who had been standing at parade rest with his eyes wet, and she said, "Bring me a table." They brought a table. They set it on the deck between me and the formation, plain folding steel. And Daria Van looked at me and said, "Open it, Opal. You don't have to carry it shut anymore." So I took out my multi-tool. My hands were steady. They have always been steady. That is the whole curse and the whole gift of me. And I worked the blade under the soldered seam my father had closed years before. And I pried it, slow, the old metal giving with a sound like a held breath letting go. The lid came up, and I lifted out what was inside and set it on the table without a word, the way you lay something down at a graveside. A reel of mission audio in a flat tin canister. A flight log bound in cracked leather, his hand and then my hand alternating down the pages. And a long envelope sealed with a classification stamp across the flap, my service number typed on the front. You've probably already guessed what was on that reel. You have not. Van picked up the canister. She handed it to Hollis and gave him a low instruction, and a moment later a sound system meant for a graduation address crackled, and the Admiral faced the formation and the families, and lifted her voice. 23 years ago, she said, a recovery aircraft went out in weather that grounded everyone else. The helicopter was hit. It was hit a second time, and the pilot did not break formation, did not raise her voice, and brought every person aboard back across the water, alive. The record of that night was sealed. The pilot's name was sealed with it, and because it was sealed, a paper trail was allowed to stand that said she had simply walked away. Listen. Then she played 10 seconds of it. It is a strange thing to hear your own voice come back to you across 23 years and an ocean. It came out of those speakers thin and calm, a young woman's voice flattened by altitude and radio static. And it said coordinates, and it said a heading, and it said, without a tremor, that she had the package and she was bringing the quiet one home. Fly the quiet one home. That was the bird's call sign, the crippled aircraft I would not abandon. And my father had said those 5 words at the dinner table for years and let the family think it was an old man going soft when all along it was the proudest thing he knew, and the one piece of the truth he was allowed to speak out loud. The real hissed to silence. Nobody on that deck breathed. And Admiral Daria Van picked up the sealed envelope, broke the classification stamp with her thumb, and read the citation aloud, the commendation that had waited 23 years in a soldered box in a dead man's workshop. She read the date. She read the action. She read the line that named the so-called desertion for exactly what it had been, a blackout imposed from above, an order to vanish that I had been too disciplined to break and too bound by oath to explain. And then she lowered the paper and looked out at the rows of stunned faces and the families and the one gray-faced man at the back, and she said it plain. There was no coward in this family. There was only an order she was too disciplined to break. I heard a sound from the visitor's seating, a short, broken sound. I did not have to look to know it was Marshall. Van was not finished. She reached into her own pocket and brought out a worn brass disc and held it up so the morning caught it. And even from where I stood, I could see the 2 words struck around its rim. She had the twin. Of course she had the twin. There were maybe 9 of those coins in the world, and she had carried hers the same 23 years I had carried mine, turning it over in the dark, wondering whatever became of the quiet pilot who never came home to be thanked. I have spent 2 decades, she said, telling new aviators a story I was not certain was true, because the proof was sealed and the woman was gone. The Navy is going to correct that. The filing that called her absent will be reviewed and struck. Her separation will be set right in the only language this institution respects, which is the written record. She looked at me. Your discharge will read honorable, Opal. It always should have. I am going to see that it does. I did not cry. I want that noted too, because every part of me wanted to. I stood straight back the way I have stood my whole life, the way they mocked me for. The stillness they swore meant I was empty when all along it was the only thing keeping the bird in the air, and I let it be true on the outside while it came apart on the inside. The ceremony went on. My brother Wade got his trident. I watched a chief press it to his chest, and I watched the boy I used to fly home in the dark become a man in front of the whole Navy. And when he turned in the formation, he found my face in the crowd, and he could not hold it. His face folded, 23 years of believing the family lie crumpling all at once. He knew now. They all knew now. Afterward, on the grass at the foot of the deck, Marshall came to me. He did not come the way he had come that morning, chin up, working the crowd. He came like a man walking to the edge of something. The flag pin was still on his lapel, crooked now. His hands were shaking the way they shake when the thing you built your whole self on has gone out from under you in front of everyone you know. I didn't, he started. Stopped. Opal, I didn't know. The store, He couldn't finish that either. I knew about the back room off 23rd, the locked one he never let anyone into, the envelopes he stopped opening, the notices stacking up, the family name the last collateral a drowning man had left. He had made me the coward so there would be one Jessup who ran, and it would not have to be him. And now the water was at his own chin, and there was nobody left to point at. He waited for me to say it, to name the back room, to read his citation aloud the way Van had read mine. It would have been easy. It would have been just. I took my coin out of my pocket, the brass one. Night Reaper worn smooth at the high points from 23 years of being the only thing that knew my name. And I took his shaking hand and I turned it over, and I set the coin in his palm and closed his fingers over it the way I had closed my own 10,000 times. You were a chief once, I said, before any of it. That was real. Keep this. Stop drinking the other thing. He He looked at the coin in his hand and his face came apart entirely. This loud man, this patriarch, weeping into the lapel of his sport coat on the grass at Coronado while his great-nephew's classmates filed past. I left him with it. Some debts you collect by forgiving them. There was a candidate at the edge of the crowd, a quiet kid, the one with the scholarship, the one a Chief J had funded years ago with one instruction. He had washed nearly out, and I'd given him 3 words on the worst morning of his life, and they'd held him on the line. He came up to me now, unsure, and I understood that my father had not only set this morning in motion, he had handed me the next one. There would always be a quiet one near the back that the loud ones had written off. I knew now what I was supposed to do with them, so I did the last thing. Wade was getting his first assignment, his first command someday, and a man needs a place to keep the things that tell the truth about him. That night in Hollis's shed, with a borrowed iron, I soldered shut a fresh gunmetal tin, laid the bead clean along the seam the way my father taught me, and in the morning at the foot of the flag that never comes down, I pressed it into my brother's hands. He held it like it weighed more than it did. I closed his fingers over the seam. Night Reaper flies again.